so today's lesson is going to be on property and casualty policy structure. So if you saw our video this morning, we just did kind of a brief overview of the DICE, right? What makes up that policy structure, which is your declarations, insuring agreement, conditions, and exclusions. Throughout this video, I'm going to go into way more detail about what falls under each one of these sections. I'm also going to show you example questions, and we're going to talk about what to look out for on the exam, some of those kind of tricky nuances that seem simple when you're going through the material, but definitely things that can trip you up on the exam if you're not aware of it and you're not looking out for it. So on the exam, you will have a mix of questions where they might just ask you what makes up the policy structure, right? So you'll just need to be able to identify that it's the declarations, insuring agreement, conditions, and exclusions. But then you'll also need to have an idea of what falls under each one of these sections. So let's talk in more detail about what falls under declarations, insuring agreement, conditions, and exclusions. So declarations, of course, is your who, what, when, where, and how much. So your who, that represents, of course, the insured, right? That's who. That means their name and their address. The what identifies what is covered, right? Meaning their property, and that could be the building itself, right? But as well as their personal property, right? Or if we're talking about car insurance, that's the car, right? Or if it's business auto, that's the business vehicles, right? So that's the what is covered. When is your effective date, right? Your start date and your end date. Where is your policy territory? So if we're talking about property coverage, right, a homeowners, it's where is the home located? If we're talking about auto, that's your territory coverage, right? So that would be the US, its territories, Puerto Rico and Canada, right? We don't have coverage that extends to Mexico, right? So you're going to need to know what those policy territories are for each policy. I have another video where I went into detail about where that policy territory differs for each policy. So check that out if you're struggling with that, because it is different for each type of policy. And then the how much, that's talking about your coverages, right? So what is the premium, as well as what are the policy limits? So that's your who, what, when, where, and how much, all falls under the declarations. So again, questions on the exam could be things like, what makes up the policy structure, right? So it might say something like, the policy structure is made up of the declarations, insuring agreement, conditions, and what else? And you'll need to know its exclusions. But it also might say something like, in the declarations, where would the policy territory, or not in the declarations, that would be the question, right? So I would say, like, where is the policy territory listed? And you'll need to know that that's in the declarations, right? So you'll kind of need to know both. So moving on to insuring agreement, that is kind of the heart of the policy, right? That's anything that the insurance company or the insurer, right, being called the insuring agreement, so the insurer promises to do. That's going to include the fact that the insurance company has to indemnify the insured, right? So that's the insurer's responsibilities to indemnify the insured, but also that's going to list out the covered perils and any additional or supplemental coverage. Now, this is where people tend to get tripped up, and this is how they can get you with questions on the exam. When it comes to what is covered up here in the declaration versus these covered perils, look out for this on the exam. When the question is talking about what is covered, again, it's talking about property, right? So that building, your personal property, your couches, your fence, your bed, right? That's the what. That is going to be found in the declarations. The covered perils, that is found in the insuring agreement, right? So fire, windstorm, lightning, hail, right? That's your covered perils. So anything from the insurance company, right? The insurance company agreeing to cover fire, right? That's your covered peril. That's going to be listed in the insuring agreement. Your who, what, when, where, and how much is in your declarations, right? So the what piece of it is up in declaration. So look out for that. I know that can get a little bit tricky and confusing on questions, so keep that in the back of your head. Conditions is the rights and obligations of the insured, right? So if you think about insuring agreement, that's the insurer's promises. Conditions is the rights of the insured, right? So kind of keep it separated like that. So the insured's responsibilities and obligations, right? So providing that proof of loss, right? Everything the insured has to do from the time of application to the time of loss. And then lastly, exclusions, of course, is going to be your exclusions, right? What is not covered. But on the exams, they're not going to make it that easy for you, right? They're not going to say, where would the exclusions be listed in the policy, right? They're not going to word it like that. They're going to use words like, where would coverage that's omitted from coverage, right? We don't walk around using the word omitted. I know a lot of our students that are bilingual that had Spanish as a first language and even English as a first language, right? We don't use the word omitted that often. So omitted from coverage, that means your exclusions. Same thing with reductions in coverage. All of that is going to be in the exclusions section. So of course it means what's not covered, but also look out for words like omitted from coverage and any reductions in coverage. So let's look at some example questions. So first one here says, what part of the policy or what part of the insurance contract describes a loss for which the insured will not be indemnified? So of course, not being indemnified, right? That's going to be your exclusions, what they're not going to cover. It's excluded from coverage. So you can see, as always, the exam writers are going to not make it easy on us, right? So they're going to word that kind of funky. What are they not going to indemnify? Your exclusions, right? It's not covered. So that's going to be D. Next one here says, what should be reviewed to determine if a particular loss is covered by an HO3 special form? So this one here, this is going to be C, exclusions. So this one here, you want to look out for the fact that it's an HO3 policy. We know with an HO3, that's an open peril, right, or a special peril policy. So we're only going to have exclusions. Same thing with HO3 and HO5, right? So for those, to find out what's covered or what's not covered, you would look at exclusions. If it's any other policy, right? If it's an HO1, HO2, HO4, HO6, or HO8, you're going to look in the insuring clause, right? Because that's where it's going to list out those covered perils. So I'll repeat that again to make sure it makes sense. So if the question said, what should be reviewed to determine if a particular loss is covered? If it's HO1, 2, 4, 6, or 8, the answer would be the insuring clause, because again, that's where it's going to list out your covered perils, right? That's going to be in your insuring clause. This question is asking about an HO3. So your HO3 and your HO5 are open peril forms that you're going to look in the exclusions, right? Because it doesn't list the covered perils, it only lists the exclusions. So that would be C. This question here says, to see which vehicles are covered under a business auto policy, you should look at which section of the policy. The answer to this one is C, the declaration page. This is what I was talking about back on the prior slide, where I was saying this can get tricky for people between the covered perils versus that what, right? So this is talking about to see which vehicles or what vehicles are covered, right? So this is your what. The who, what, when, where, and how much is covered under your declarations, right? So if we want to see what vehicles or which vehicles, we're looking in the declarations page, right? So that's part of our deck page, right? The who, what, when, where, and how much, right? That covers our property and our personal property, or not covers it, it lists what's covered there. So that's going to be C, declarations. And then lastly, under our commercial package policy, the common policy declarations page shows the who, what, when, where, and the answer here is B, how much. It's not how it will happen, it's B, how much, right? Which of course is talking about the premium and the policy limits. Under a CPP and a BOP, the only two required sections are your declarations and your conditions. So try to remember that. Either think CD. I know nowadays they don't even make CDs anymore, but try to remember CD or DC. However, you need to remember that in your head. But they're the only two required sections. So every other policy, you're going to see all four sections for the most part: your declarations, insuring agreement, conditions, and exclusions. But in both a CPP and a BOP, the only two required sections, $85 off of our premium on-demand class. So you get every single chapter of me teaching you every single chapter. Also includes a 100+ practice exam, where I also include a video where I explain, just like we did with the questions here, I explain each one of those questions. It includes a study guide, a whole bunch of resources for you. A lot of you already ran to get that. So if you haven't already, get it. It's a huge deal going on. It's only lasting for this week. The coupon code is Give Thanks. All one word, Give Thanks. Rooting for you. You got this.